The smell of roasting chicken and rosemary usually filled me with a quiet contentment, a familiar warmth that had been the backdrop to most of my life. Tonight, it just felt heavy. My name is Eloise, and I'm 74 years old, though some days I feel 100 and others barely alive. For as long as I can remember, my life has been a series of sacrifices, small and large, all made for my family. I remember the year Grace, my granddaughter, was born. She's 22 now, a beautiful, spirited young woman, but back then, she was just a tiny bundle. My son Matthew, who's 45, and his wife Sarah, 41, were overwhelmed, as new parents often are. I'd offered to help, of course. That offer turned into daily visits, then overnight stays, then weeks at a time. I canceled a trip to Italy I'd saved for years for, a dream I'd held since I was a girl. "Oh, Mom, you're a lifesaver," Matthew had said, squeezing my arm. My daughter Lila, who's 35, and always been a bit more distant, had been sick with the flu that same winter. I'd spent 2 weeks at her place, cooking, cleaning, bringing her medicine, while my Italy tickets gathered dust on the fridge. She'd barely even thanked me, just waved a weak hand and said, "Thanks, Mom, you're the best." It wasn't a thank you, not really. It was an expectation. Tonight, as I stirred the gravy, the familiar hum of my family's chatter drifted in from the living room. Matthew was laughing, a loud, booming sound that always grated on my nerves a little. Sarah's voice, a little too bright, cut through it. "Honestly, we wouldn't have managed that down payment without Grandma, would we?" she said, and I heard Matthew chuckle in agreement. "Grandma always has our backs," he added, his tone light, as if he were talking about a reliable appliance. They weren't talking to me, of course, just about me, as if I wasn't in the next room, my hands still aching from kneading the dough for the rolls they loved. It wasn't just the down payment on their last car or the loan for Matthew's new office equipment or the countless times I'd covered Grace's college tuition when they were a bit short. It was a steady flow, an open tap they just assumed would never run dry. I set the gravy aside and started pulling the roasted potatoes from the oven, the heat blooming on my face. My reflection in the dark glass of the oven door showed a woman with tired eyes, but a steady gaze. How many dinners had I cooked in this kitchen? How many birthday cakes had I decorated? How many scraped knees had I kissed better? How many tears had I wiped away? I'd organized every holiday, every family reunion, every milestone celebration. I was the family's anchor, their emotional labor outsourced, their personal event planner, chef, and bank. There was pride, yes, in the memories of laughter and warmth, but tonight a sharp bitterness pricked at the edges of it. It felt less like love given freely and more like a service rendered, taken for granted. Just as I was about to call them to the table, a snippet of Matthew's conversation drifted clearly into the kitchen. He'd moved closer to the archway, his voice a little lower, conspiratorial. "Honestly, the cottage is just sitting there," he said. "It's a huge asset. We could easily get a good price for it, especially with the market the way it is." My hand froze on the oven mitt. The cottage. My parents' cottage, where I'd spent every summer of my childhood, where I'd taken Matthew and Lila every year until they were grown. It was filled with memories, with the scent of pine and lake water, with the echoes of my own parents' laughter. It wasn't just a property, it was a piece of my soul. Sarah's voice, a little muffled, responded, "But Your mom, she loves that place. Matthew scoffed. She hasn't been up there in years. What's she going to do with it? It's just sitting there, losing value. Think of what we could do with that money. My heart hammered against my ribs. They weren't talking about my wishes, my sentimental value. They were talking about an asset, a number on a spreadsheet, and they were talking about what they could do with the money. Not what I could do, not what we could do. Just them. The warmth of the kitchen suddenly felt like a chill. The conversation about the cottage, overheard just a few weeks ago, had left a sour taste in my mouth that no amount of perfectly seasoned gravy could wash away. It wasn't just the idea of them selling it. It was the casual way they discussed my property, my memories, as if they were already theirs to dispose of. That feeling of being an outsider, even in my own home, only seemed to deepen with each passing week. Last Sunday, at what was supposed to be a celebratory brunch for Matthew's latest promotion, I found myself perched on the edge of the sofa, a plate of untouched quiche growing cold in my lap. The conversation flowed around me, a rapid current of office politics, investment strategies, and the latest trendy restaurants. I tried to interject once, attempting to share a funny anecdote from my own working days, something about a particularly stubborn client I'd had back when I was a bookkeeper. Sarah, Matthew's wife, barely glanced my way. "Oh, Grandma, that's ancient history," she said, with a dismissive wave of her hand, turning back to Matthew with a bright, artificial smile. "Tell them about the new client, darling, the one from New York." The word stung, a small, sharp prick that I tried to ignore. Ancient history. Was that all my life was to them now? It wasn't just the overt dismissals. It was the little things, the constant, subtle reminders of my age and their perceived superiority. Grace, my granddaughter, who usually had a kind heart, had started picking up on her parents' habits. Just last month, she'd been showing me pictures on her phone, laughing about some TikTok challenge. I'd leaned in, trying to see, and she'd pulled back slightly. "Oh, Grandma, you wouldn't get it," she'd said, a little too quickly, a little too patronizingly. "It's a Gen Z thing." She hadn't meant to be cruel, I knew, but the words still landed like tiny stones in my chest. Then there was Lila, my daughter Lila, who is 35. We'd always had a complicated relationship, a bit distant, but I'd always tried to maintain a connection. A few weeks ago, I'd seen pictures plastered all over Sarah's social media of a mother-daughter brunch at a fancy downtown cafe. Sarah, Grace, and Lila, all smiling, clinking mimosas. There was no invitation for me, no mention, just the pictures, a stark reminder of my exclusion. I wanted to ask Lila about it, but the words just wouldn't come. What was the point? To hear some flimsy excuse? It hurt more to know they hadn't even thought to include me. Each slight, each dismissive comment I swallowed down. I'd been through worse, I told myself. It was just a phase. They were busy, preoccupied with their own lives. They loved me. Of course they did. They just had a funny way of showing it sometimes. I forced a tight smile onto my face, a practiced mask I'd worn for years, convincing myself that if I just kept being accommodating, kept being the supportive, invisible backbone, things would eventually go back to how they were. But the truth was, the pain of exclusion was deepening, carving out a hollow space inside me where warmth used to be. The loneliness A quiet hum beneath the surface of my days grew louder. I was sitting in my favorite armchair, trying to lose myself in a book, when my phone buzzed on the side table. It was Lila, a text message. My heart gave a little flutter of hope. Maybe she was finally reaching out. Maybe she'd realized. But the message was short, blunt. Family meeting my place, Friday 7 p.m., important. No, hi Mom, no, how are you? Just the cold, imperative tone of family meeting. My mind raced. What could be so important? Was it about the cottage? Had Matthew finally convinced them? A knot of apprehension tightened in my stomach. Something significant was indeed going to be discussed. I just didn't know yet that it was a setup and that I was the unsuspecting target. Friday evening arrived with a chill in the air, mirroring the apprehension in my gut. I drove to Lila's place, a small, modern townhouse she'd bought a few years ago, mostly with a significant gift from me. The streetlights cast long, skeletal shadows as I pulled up. My hope, a fragile thing, warred with the growing dread. Maybe this was it, I thought. Maybe they were finally going to acknowledge everything, apologize for the slights, for the casual dismissals. When I stepped inside, Matthew, Sarah, and Lila were already seated around Lila's sleek dining table. Grace wasn't there, which struck me as odd. She usually made an effort to be present, even if just to offer a quiet smile. The air was thick with a forced cordiality, like a poorly rehearsed play. Matthew cleared his throat, a sound that always signaled he was about to deliver some important pronouncement. "Thanks for coming, Mom," he began, his voice surprisingly gentle, too gentle. "We wanted to talk about some family plans, big picture stuff." My heart gave a little flutter. Family plans. Maybe it was good news. Maybe they wanted to discuss a family vacation or a new project we could all work on together. I sat down, trying to project an air of calm, though my hands were clasped tightly in my lap. "We've been thinking a lot about the future," Sarah chimed in, her smile a little too wide, a little too fixed, "especially with your advancing years, Eloise." The phrase hung in the air, a thinly veiled reference to my age, to my perceived decline. My hope deflated a little, replaced by a familiar prickle of irritation. "We just want to make sure you're comfortable, Mom," Lila added, her gaze flickering away from mine, "and that your assets are being managed wisely." Ah, there it was. My financial contributions, my assets, the real reason for this meeting. They started talking about investments, about market trends, about the cost of living. They solicited my advice, asking questions about my pension, about the small savings I had, nodding intently as I spoke. But then, almost imperceptibly, the conversation shifted. They began discussing how they could manage things, how they could make sure my money was working for me. It was all couched in terms of concern for my well-being, but the subtext was clear. My input was no longer truly valued, only my resources. Matthew leaned forward, a stack of glossy brochures in front of him. "Mom, we found this wonderful retirement community. It's got everything. Activities, medical staff on site, no more worries about house maintenance. It's perfect for downsizing." My stomach dropped. Downsizing. My beloved home. The one I'd lived in for 50 years. The one where I'd raised them. The one filled with every memory. The cottage discussion from weeks ago suddenly clicked into place. This wasn't about my well-being. It was about freeing up my assets. And to make the move easier, Sarah continued, her voice chirpy, we've already looked into some estate sales. You have so many lovely things, Eloise, but really, do you need all those old books? Or that antique cabinet? We could get a good price for them. Think of it as decluttering. Decluttering. My heirlooms. The antique cabinet that had belonged to my grandmother. The one I'd intended to pass down to Grace. The books, each one a journey, a companion through lonely nights. They were talking about selling my memories, my legacy, as if they were just junk. I tried to speak, to protest, but the words caught in my throat. They were already moving on, discussing logistics, timelines. Matthew pulled out a printed document, a pre-filled form for a real estate agent. We just need your signature here, Mom, to get the ball rolling on listing the house. And then we can start moving some of the smaller items into storage or for sale. My head swam. It was a trap. They had planned all of this without me, for me, but not with me. They had feigned concern, solicited my advice, only to present a fully formed plan that stripped me of my home, my possessions, my autonomy. I looked from Matthew Nazarneki, Izarneshesai, Aziyinchi, Ayasikwarchini, Sai, Yeste Sarah's overly bright smile, to Lila's averted gaze. They had agreed to proceed with this plan without my consent, without even a genuine discussion. I was just a formality, a signature needed to unlock their next financial venture. The feeling of powerlessness was a cold, bitter wave washing over me. I had walked right into it. The family meeting at Lila's townhouse had been a chilling prelude, a quiet, insidious ambush. I had managed to avoid signing the real estate forms that night, claiming I needed to think it over, a flimsy excuse they seemed to accept, albeit with thinly veiled impatience. But the feeling of betrayal, of having my life planned out from under me, festered. I spent the next few days in a fog, the silence of my house amplifying the hollowness inside me. Then came the invitation to Matthew's company fundraiser, a big, splashy event at a downtown hotel ballroom. Matthew had insisted I come, saying it was important for his image, for his clients to see he was a family man. I'd agreed, hoping perhaps for a moment of genuine connection, a chance to talk to them, to make them understand. How naive I was. The ballroom was a cacophony of polite chatter, clinking glasses, and the soft murmur of a jazz band. I stood awkwardly by a pillar, feeling like a ghost, watching Matthew glad-handing clients, Sarah laughing a little too loudly at some executive's joke. Then Matthew tapped a microphone, and the music faded. He stood on a small dais, beaming, Sarah beside him, looking radiant. "Good evening, everyone," Matthew's voice boomed, amplified by the speakers. "Thank you all for coming to support our annual charity drive. And tonight, we have a very special announcement, something we're incredibly excited about." My stomach tightened. My eyes darted to Lila, who was standing near the back, looking uncomfortable, her gaze fixed on the floor. Grace, my granddaughter, was nowhere to be seen. "As many of you know," Matthew continued, a practiced sincerity in his voice, "my wonderful mother, Eloise, has been a cornerstone of our family for decades. She's always been incredibly generous, always putting us first." He gestured to me, and a few polite claps rippled through the crowd. I managed a weak smile, my cheeks burning. "And now," he went on, his voice rising with theatrical flair, "she's decided to embark on a new chapter, to downsize and simplify her life. As part of this exciting transition, Eloise has generously decided to liquidate some of her assets, including her beautiful family home and several valuable heirlooms, to contribute to a new family fund. He paused, letting the words sink in. It's a win-win for everyone. She gets to enjoy a more relaxed lifestyle, and we, as a family, get to invest in our collective future, perhaps even a new family vacation home. A murmur went through the crowd. My blood ran cold. Liquidate her assets. New family fund. Win-win for everyone. It was all a lie, a public performance designed to justify their greed. My home, my memories, my very life reduced to a transaction announced like a business deal at a charity fundraiser. Sarah stepped forward, taking the microphone from Matthew. And honestly, she chirped, her voice dripping with false sweetness, old people don't need all this stuff anyway, do they? All those dusty antiques, that big house, it's just too much upkeep. This way she can relax and we can all benefit. She laughed, a brittle, dismissive sound, and a few people in the crowd chuckled along. The words, old people don't need all this stuff anyway, hit me like a physical blow. My vision blurred, my dignity stripped away in front of friends, acquaintances, and strangers. I saw a few sympathetic glances, a few shocked expressions, but mostly, people just looked away, embarrassed for me, or perhaps just indifferent. The humiliation was a hot, searing wave washing over me, leaving me feeling exposed and utterly worthless. My heart sank plummeting into a pit of despair. This wasn't just about money. It was about their complete disregard for my feelings, for my very existence as a person with agency and desires. For a moment, I felt an overwhelming urge to scream, to lash out, to shatter the elegant facade of the ballroom. But then, a strange calm settled over me, a cold, hard resolve. I looked at Matthew, at Sarah, at their smug, self-satisfied faces. They saw me as an ATM, a resource to be tapped, a problem to be managed. But I was not an ATM. I was Eloise Johnson. I took a deep breath, the air tasting metallic. My voice, when it came, was quiet but firm, cutting through the polite murmur that had resumed. Matthew, I said, my voice steady, though my hands trembled slightly. Sarah, they both looked at me, surprised, their smiles faltering. The jazz music had started up again, but it seemed to dim around me. I heard what you said, I continued, my gaze unwavering. And I want to make something very clear. I paused, letting my words hang in the air, drawing a few more curious glances. I am not your ATM. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint strains of the jazz band. Matthew's face went pale. Sarah's fixed smile vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. For the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of power, a spark of my own boundaries being drawn. The silence in the ballroom after my declaration was thick enough to cut with a knife. Matthew and Sarah stood frozen on the dais, their faces a mixture of shock and outrage. I didn't wait for their reaction. I simply turned and walked out, the sounds of the jazz band and polite chatter fading behind me. The cool night air hit my face like a balm, but it couldn't soothe the raw wound in my heart. I drove home on autopilot, the city lights blurring into streaks. When I finally stepped into my dimly lit kitchen, the silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the earlier chaos. I put the kettle on, my hands still trembling slightly, and made myself a cup of tea. It sat there, steaming gently, growing cold as I stared into the dark liquid, replaying the scene in my mind. I am not your ATM. The words had felt powerful, a release, but now, alone, a wave of shock and disbelief washed over me. Had I really just done that? Had I finally publicly stood up to them? The house felt vast and empty, filled with echoes of a past that no longer felt real. I thought about all the choices I'd made, the sacrifices, the endless giving. Had it all been for this? To be reduced to a financial asset, to be publicly humiliated. The tea was stone cold by the time I finally took a sip. The next few days were a blur of quiet reflection. My phone remained silent. No calls from Matthew, Sarah, or even Lila. Grace, bless her heart, sent a text, a simple, "Are you okay, Grandma?" I replied, "I will be," and left it at that. The silence from the others spoke volumes. I started small, with acts of quiet defiance. For years, my easel had been tucked away in the attic, gathering dust. I'd loved to paint in my younger days, landscapes mostly, the vibrant colors of nature. I pulled it out, dusted off my old paintbrushes, and bought a fresh set of paints. The first few strokes were hesitant, clumsy, but soon the familiar rhythm returned. It was a small rebellion, a reclaiming of a part of myself I'd long neglected. I also started reconnecting with old friends. Harold Thompson, who was 76, had been a neighbor for decades before he moved to a smaller place across town a few years ago. We used to share gardening tips over the fence. I called him, tentatively at first. He sounded genuinely pleased to hear from me. We met for coffee at a small cafe, and I found myself pouring out snippets of what had happened, carefully editing out the most painful parts. Harold just listened, nodding occasionally, his kind eyes full of understanding. "Eloise," he said, his voice gentle, "you've always been too good to them. It's time you put yourself first." His simple words were a balm, a reminder that there were people who saw me, truly saw me, beyond my role as a family provider. As I painted, as I talked with Harold, patterns started to emerge, like hidden figures in a painting. Their concern for my well-being, their help with my finances, their advice on downsizing, it all clicked into place. Their love, I realized with a bitter pang, had always come with strings attached. The countless times I'd babysat, the money I'd given, the emotional support I'd provided, it wasn't just generosity on my part. It was an expectation on theirs. I remembered Matthew's loan for his new car, which was never repaid, Sarah's casual remarks about my old news stories, Lila's forgotten brunch invitation. Each incident, once dismissed as a minor slight, now shone with a new, stark clarity. They hadn't just taken me for granted. They had manipulated me, subtly, consistently, for years. One afternoon, Harold suggested I visit the local community center. They have all sorts of programs for seniors, he'd said, and a wonderful support group. You might find it helpful. Hesitantly, I went. The first meeting was awkward, but as women shared their stories, I found myself nodding along, a growing sense of recognition washing over me. There was Eleanor, whose children had tried to pressure her into selling her farm, and Maria, whose grandchildren had taken advantage of her good nature for years. Their stories resonated deeply. They had survived similar betrayals, found their footing, and rebuilt their lives. They offered not just friendship, but practical advice, a sense of shared experience that made me feel less alone, less like a fool. They reminded me that my value wasn't tied to what I could provide, but to who I was. And for the first time in a long time, I started to believe it. The support group at the community center, along with Harold's quiet encouragement, had given me a new perspective. They didn't just listen. They offered practical advice, urging me to understand my own financial standing. It was Eleanor, a sharp woman with a no-nonsense attitude, who finally convinced me. "Eloise," she'd said, "you can't fight a battle you don't understand. Go see a financial advisor. Know your numbers." It felt like a monumental step, walking into the sleek, modern office of Mr. Davies, the financial advisor Eleanor had recommended. The air conditioning was a little too cold, the silence a little too formal, but Mr. Davies himself was kind, his eyes reassuring behind his spectacles. He listened patiently as I stumbled through my story, the humiliation of the fundraiser still raw. Then we got down to business. He asked for my bank statements, my pension details, my property deeds. As he crunched numbers on his computer, I felt a familiar knot of anxiety. I knew I had some savings, a portion of my pension I'd quietly put aside over the years, a small nest egg for emergencies. But I'd always thought of it as just that small. What he revealed next shocked me. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, turning the screen towards me, "do you realize the value of your assets?" He pointed to figures on the screen. My pension, which I'd contributed to diligently for decades, was substantial. The house, in a desirable neighborhood, had appreciated significantly over the years. And the cottage, the one Matthew was so eager to sell, was worth far more than I'd ever imagined. My small emergency nest egg, combined with these, amounted to a considerable sum. "You are, by all accounts, financially independent, Mrs. Johnson," Mr. Davies stated, a slight smile on his face. "More than independent, in fact. You have a very comfortable retirement ahead of you, should you choose to access these funds." I stared at the numbers, dumbfounded. All those years, I'd worried about being a burden, about needing my children, about being taken care of. All those years, I'd been quietly building my own security, without even realizing the full extent of it. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had more control than I ever thought possible. As Mr. Davies continued to explain my options, a new clarity dawned. He showed me how much my children had truly depended on my financial support. The down payments, the loans, the tuition fees, they weren't just small favors. They were significant contributions that had enabled Matthew and Sarah's comfortable lifestyle, Grace's education, and even Lila's townhouse. Their plans, their perceived financial stability, were deeply tied to my generosity. Without my steady flow of funds, their carefully constructed world would likely falter. It wasn't just my emotional labor they'd exploited, it was my financial stability. Mr. Davies treated me with a quiet respect I hadn't felt from my own family in years. He wasn't looking at me as an old woman to be managed, but as a capable individual with significant assets and the right to make her own decisions. He laid out legal options, ways to protect my property and my savings, to ensure no one could touch them without my explicit consent. He spoke of trusts, of updated wills, of separate accounts. Each option he presented reinforced my value, not as a resource, but as a person deserving of autonomy and security. I left his office feeling a surge of purpose, the humiliation of the fundraiser, the quiet despair of the past weeks began to recede, replaced by a growing sense of resolve. I had been collecting evidence of their manipulation, not just for myself, but for the clarity it brought. Now I started gathering concrete proof of my financial contributions, old bank statements, receipts for tuition payments, records of property taxes I'd paid on the cottage, even when they were using it. Each document I found, each number I confirmed, solidified my understanding of their dependence and my own strength. I wasn't just a victim. I was a woman with agency, with resources, and with a clear path forward. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning. Armed with Mr. Davies's advice and the cold, hard facts of my own financial standing, a sense of quiet determination settled over me. The fear that had gnawed at me for weeks began to recede, replaced by a steely resolve. It was time to act. My first decisive step was to update my will. I spent an afternoon with Mr. Davies, meticulously outlining my wishes. My home, my cottage, my savings. Everything was carefully allocated, with specific instructions that left no room for ambiguity. I opened a new, separate bank account, transferring a significant portion of my liquid assets into it, ensuring that my children, who only had access to my old accounts for emergencies, could no longer touch my money. It felt like severing a cord, a necessary break from years of financial entanglement. With my finances secured, I began to enforce new boundaries. It wasn't easy. The family had grown accustomed to my endless availability, my unquestioning support. The first test came when Matthew called, his voice tight with barely concealed frustration. "Mom, the car needs new tires and Sarah's credit card is maxed out. Can you just transfer some funds like you usually do?" My heart pounded, a familiar urge to just say yes, to make things easy, to avoid conflict. But I remembered Mr. Davies's words, Harold's encouragement, and the faces of the women at the community center. "No, Matthew," I said, my voice steady, surprising even myself. "I can't. You'll have to figure that out yourselves." A stunned silence met my words. Then Matthew's voice, sharp with disbelief. "What do you mean, you can't? Mom, this isn't a game. We need those tires. We're counting on you. And I'm counting on you to be self-sufficient," I replied, my voice gaining strength. "My financial support is no longer something you can expect. You need to manage your own expenses." I hung up before he could argue further, my hand shaking slightly, but a surge of triumph bubbling inside me. The confrontations escalated. Matthew and Sarah showed up at my door a few days later, their faces a mixture of anger and desperation. "Mom, what is going on?" Matthew demanded, stepping into my living room without an invitation. "The bank called. You moved funds around. We can't access your account anymore." "That's correct," I said, meeting his gaze evenly. "My accounts are now private. They are for my expenses, not yours." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "But what about the house and the cottage? We had plans. You agreed to downsize." "I agreed to consider downsizing," I corrected her calmly. "I never agreed to sell my home or my cottage for your benefit. They are my properties, and they are not for sale." "But Mom, we need that capital," Matthew pleaded, his voice rising. "We have investments planned. That new vacation home we talked about, Grace's grad school tuition next year." The audacity of it, the sheer entitlement was breathtaking. They were panicking, not because I was in trouble, but because their source of easy money had dried up. I looked at their desperate faces, and for the first time, I saw them not as my children, but as adults who had relied on me to solve all their problems, to fund their dreams, to subsidize their lives. And I realized, with a profound clarity, that my worth was not tied to my financial support. It was tied to my own dignity, my own strength. I took a deep breath, looking from Matthew to Sarah, my gaze unwavering. "You may see me as a cash cow," I told them, my voice firm. "But I'm so much more than that. I am Eloise, and my money is no longer your safety net." The words hung in the air, a definitive line drawn in the sand. The old Eloise, the accommodating, sacrificing Eloise, was gone. And the new one was here to stay. The old house, the one I'd called home for 50 years, felt like a cage after that last confrontation. Every corner held a memory, but also the echo of a slight, a dismissal. It was time to truly reclaim my space, my life. Within a few months, with the help of Harold and some of my new friends from the community center, I found a cozy apartment across town. It was smaller, yes, but it was mine, truly mine. I filled it with my own eclectic art, the landscapes I'd started painting again, vibrant and full of life, and the few cherished heirlooms I'd rescued from the clutches of Matthew and Sarah's downsizing plans. The antique cabinet, rescued from their proposed estate sale, now held my favorite books, each one a testament to my own quiet resilience. My days unfolded with a newfound rhythm. Mornings were for painting, afternoons for walks in the nearby park with Harold, or lively discussions at the community center. I nurtured these new relationships, these friendships built on mutual respect and shared laughter, not on what I could provide. Eleanor and Maria became regular coffee companions, their wisdom a comfort and balm. I felt seen, valued for who I was, not for what I owned or what I could give. The peace that settled over me was profound, a quiet hum of contentment I hadn't realized I was missing for so long. Meanwhile, the silence from Matthew and Sarah was deafening, punctuated only by frantic, increasingly desperate phone calls. Their carefully constructed world, built on my generosity, had begun to crumble. Matthew's investments had stalled without the capital he'd expected from my house sale. Sarah's lavish lifestyle, once subsidized by my gifts, became unsustainable. I heard through the grapevine a casual remark from a former neighbor that they were struggling, cutting back, even arguing more frequently. The new vacation home was a distant dream, and Grace's grad school tuition was suddenly a looming, unaddressed problem. The dynamic had shifted irrevocably. They were facing the consequences of their actions, and it was a bitter pill for them to swallow. Then, one rainy afternoon, Lila showed up at my new apartment. She looked tired, her shoulders slumped. "Mom," she started, her voice barely a whisper, "I heard about everything. Matthew's been complaining nonstop about money and what he said at that fundraiser." She trailed off, her gaze meeting mine, full of a raw regret I hadn't seen in her eyes in years. "It was awful, Mom. I should have said something then. I should have stood up for you." She sat down, her hands clasped. "I've been so caught up in my own life, I didn't see it. Or maybe I did, and I just chose to ignore it. Matthew's always been like this, but we enabled him. I enabled him. I'm so sorry." It wasn't a full reconciliation, not yet, but it was a crack in the wall, a genuine acknowledgement of their selfishness. Lila, finally confronting her own complicity, had come back to seek a real connection. She told me about a heated argument she'd had with Matthew, where she'd finally called him out on his entitlement. It had been ugly, she admitted, but necessary. A few weeks later, Matthew called. His voice was subdued, devoid of its usual booming confidence. "Mom," he began, a hesitant pause. We miss you. Grace misses you. Things are difficult. We're learning to manage, but it's hard." There was no apology, not explicitly, but the tone was different. It was an admission of vulnerability, a grudging acknowledgement of the void I'd left. I didn't rush to fill it. I didn't offer money. But when Grace, my sweet Grace, called a few days later, her voice soft and genuinely loving, asking if I'd like to have lunch, I said yes. She came to my new apartment, admiring my paintings, listening intently as I spoke about my new friends. She was still my granddaughter, and she saw me, truly saw me. The family gatherings, when they eventually resumed, were different. The casual dismissals were gone. Matthew and Sarah were more subdued, less demanding. They still had their struggles, but they were their struggles. They started asking for my advice on things that didn't involve my money, and sometimes they even listened. It was a tentative, fragile rebuilding, a relationship now based on a painful but necessary truth. They were learning, slowly, to appreciate my presence, not my purse. I sat in my sunlit living room one morning, sipping tea from my favorite mug, a small smile playing on my lips. The betrayal had cut deep, leaving scars, but it had also forged something new within me, a quiet strength, an unshakable dignity. My home was secure, my finances were my own, and my heart, though bruised, was finally free. The chains were broken, and Eloise, at 74, was finally, truly herself.